Midnight settled over the back lot of the Ashcroft Meridian Tower when Nolan Pierce found Vivian Ashcroft sitting alone on the concrete steps, her shoes soaked through and her face streaked with tears she had clearly tried to hide. Only hours earlier she had stood before thousands of employees as the woman nobody could touch. Now the board had stripped her of the company, her name, and her dignity, and left her locked out in the cold. Nolan draped his jacket over her shoulders, glanced up at the lit windows above them, and said quietly that he would make this right for her. Nolan finished his shift a few minutes before midnight, having just cleared an unusual alert from the server floor 2 levels below the executive suites. He was heading toward the employee exit, reserved for maintenance staff, when he spotted the woman on the steps, and for a moment he almost mistook her for a stranger who had wandered in from the street. Vivian Ashcroft had appeared on the enormous screen in the lobby that very morning, calm and commanding, the face of a company that employed thousands. He had never once seen her look like this, stripped of the armor she wore in every boardroom photograph he had passed 100 times without stopping to look twice. She had no coat, her phone battery had died an hour before, and she refused to walk out through the front entrance because a crowd of reporters had gathered there since the story broke. Nolan had watched enough people fall apart in his old career to recognize the particular stillness of someone trying not to shatter completely in front of a witness. He said nothing clever, asked no probing questions, and simply set his jacket across her shoulders before pressing a paper cup of coffee, still warm from the machine near the loading dock, into her shaking hands. Through broken sentences, she explained that the board had called an emergency session that afternoon, one she had not been told about until security arrived at her office door. She was accused of moving tens of millions of dollars through a chain of shell companies, and documents bearing her electronic signature had been presented as proof before she was given any chance to speak. Security escorted her out of the building she had run for 11 years, while her own executive assistant watched from the hallway and said nothing in her defense. Her access to every system had been revoked before she reached the parking garage, and her badge no longer opened doors that had recognized her for over a decade. Nolan listened without interrupting, filing away every detail the way he once had for a living, back when catching inconsistencies in a stranger's story had been his entire job. When she insisted the signatures were forged, something in his posture changed, subtle enough that she almost missed it in the dark. He mentioned, almost as an aside, that the cooling system in the server room had shut down manually for exactly 11 minutes the previous night, a detail buried so deep in the building's maintenance logs that almost nobody would think to check it, a gap that small could easily be dismissed as routine. Or it could be exactly the window someone needed to reach into the company's stored records without anyone noticing. Vivian turned to look at him properly for the first time, no longer seeing an anonymous night supervisor, but someone who understood far more than his uniform suggested he should. She said that by morning, every outlet in the city would call her a thief, and that nothing she said now would matter once the headlines ran. Nolan looked up at the top floors of the tower, the windows where Gideon Blackwell's office glowed even at this hour, and told her quietly that he intended to make sure that story did not stand. Vivian studied him for a long moment, uncertain whether the stranger beside her was speaking out of pity or out of something closer to certainty, and then he added, almost too casually, that this was not the first time he had seen fabricated evidence built exactly this way. Nolan led her away from the tower on foot, choosing a diner 2 blocks over that stayed open through the night and rarely saw anyone from the financial district. He picked a booth in the back corner, turned off the location tracking on both their phones, and told her firmly not to log into any company account until they understood who else might be watching those credentials. Vivian, still catching her breath from the cold, asked how a facilities supervisor came to know so much about forensic tracing, and Nolan finally admitted that his current role was a long way from where his career had actually started. 10 years earlier, he had worked as a fraud investigator for a respected accounting firm, the kind of job where uncovering a client's dishonest bookkeeping was simply Tuesday. He had discovered a client using fabricated consulting invoices to funnel money into a shell entity, and the man orchestrating that scheme had been Gideon Blackwell, then a rising investor with a reputation for buying distressed family companies and hollowing them out for profit. Nolan remembered spending 3 straight weeks cross-checking invoice numbers against delivery dates that did not exist, certain at every stage that someone above him would eventually thank him for catching it before it grew any larger. Instead, the moment he brought the pattern to his supervisors, the tone in every room he entered changed, as though he had become the problem simply by naming one. When Nolan refused a request from his own superiors to soften the report, an unrelated allegation of professional misconduct appeared in his personnel file within weeks, and though he was never formally charged, his reputation in that world never recovered. He explained that when his wife died not long after, raising his daughter Bryn alone had become the only priority he had energy left for, and chasing corporate ghosts through courtrooms no longer felt worth the cost. Vivian understood then that his promise on the steps had not come purely from sympathy. He had his own unfinished account with the man who now controlled her company. Still, Nolan set firm boundaries before agreeing to help her further, insisting they would not steal data, break into any restricted system, or make an accusation they could not back with something solid. If they made even one careless mistake, he warned her, Blackwell would happily turn them into the criminals of his own story, and every ounce of sympathy she had left would evaporate overnight. Vivian told him the board had scheduled an emergency shareholder vote in 3 days to formally confirm her removal and approve the sale of a research division central to the company's future. Once that vote passed, Blackwell would control enough voting power that any resistance afterward would be little more than symbolic noise nobody would remember by spring. Nolan laid out 3 goals on a napkin between them, numbering them so there would be no confusion about priorities going forward. First, they needed to prove her electronic signature had been used without her knowledge or consent. Second, they needed to identify exactly who had physically entered the server room during that 11-minute gap. Third, they needed to trace the money through its shell layers to whoever ultimately benefited from it, because a scandal without a beneficiary rarely convinced anyone in power. Vivian still was not entirely certain she trusted him, and she asked plainly what he expected to get out of helping a woman who, until tonight, he had likely only seen from across a lobby. Nolan answered that he wanted to watch the same board that once served Blackwell without question stand up and announce, to his face, that he had been removed. As they left the diner, Nolan noticed a black sport utility vehicle parked across the street that had not been there when they arrived, its engine idling despite the empty road around it, and he understood immediately that Blackwell already knew Vivian was no longer alone. Nolan still held limited access to the building's facility systems, since Blackwell had not yet decided a night supervisor was worth watching closely. He spent the following morning reviewing logs for the climate control units, the service elevators, the door locks, and the backup power grid, all systems kept separate from the financial network and therefore untouched by whoever had scrubbed the more sensitive records. He worked through the overnight hours with a legal pad instead of a company laptop, wary of leaving any digital trace that might later be twisted into an accusation of his own wrongdoing, a lesson he had carried since the very case that ended his old career. Line by line, he cross-referenced timestamps against badge scans and elevator calls, building a timeline the same patient way he once built cases meant for a courtroom rather than a boardroom. The maintenance data confirmed what he suspected. The server room had switched into manual bypass mode for exactly 11 minutes. The night before the board meeting, The hallway camera outside floor 47 had lost signal for the same window. A service elevator had been summoned using a senior administrative badge, and door sensors recorded 2 people entering the restricted section during that time. The badge belonged to Preston Vale, the chief financial officer, but parking garage footage showed Preston had left the building nearly an hour before that elevator was called, which meant someone else had used a cloned copy of his access credentials. Nolan could not legally copy sensitive company data on his own authority without risking exactly the kind of accusation Blackwell would love to level against him. He reached out to Tessa Holloway, a lawyer who had once helped him navigate the fallout of his old case and who still remembered how carefully that fight needed to be fought within legal lines. Tessa agreed to meet them at her private office rather than anywhere connected to the tower, and she confirmed that operational data like this could be lawfully preserved if Nolan reported it as a security incident and routed it through a protected whistleblower channel rather than simply forwarding files himself. Vivian began looking at Nolan with a different kind of respect after that meeting, realizing he understood not just the building's systems, but precisely where the legal boundaries sat and why crossing them even slightly would hand Blackwell an easy weapon. Meanwhile, Blackwell held a press conference that afternoon, describing himself as heartbroken to discover Vivian had betrayed her own family's legacy, and introducing Preston Vale as interim chief executive with practiced, sorrowful confidence. News outlets replayed footage of Vivian being escorted from the building on a loop through the evening, and the company's stock dropped sharply within hours as employees traded rumors in hushed voices across every floor. Blackwell sent Vivian a private offer through an intermediary that afternoon, promising she would avoid any criminal referral if she signed away her voting rights and agreed never to challenge the board's decision in court. Vivian came close to accepting simply to protect the thousands of employees she feared would suffer through a prolonged fight, until Nolan pointed out that the agreement's actual language did nothing to protect them at all, and instead cleared the exact legal path. Blackwell needed to sell the research division within days of the vote. Vivian tore the agreement in half without hesitation once she understood what it truly contained. Near the end of that long session, Nolan cross-referenced the mystery device that had connected to the server for exactly 11 minutes with the company's equipment registry, and found it registered under the name of Rowan Blake, the chief of staff who had stood beside Vivian for 8 years and who Vivian trusted more than almost anyone else in the building. Vivian refused at first to believe Rowan had betrayed her, insisting that Blackwell had planted her name deliberately to fracture whatever loyalty remained around her. Nolan did not push the point directly, choosing instead to ask Vivian to walk back through the small changes she may have overlooked in recent months, the kind of shifts that felt insignificant one at a time, but formed a pattern when placed together. Slowly, Vivian recalled that Rowan had repeatedly volunteered to hold her authentication device during long meetings, had rearranged her calendar at the last possible moment more than once, had gently discouraged her from attending certain audit reviews, had kept her away from a private conversation with the head of cybersecurity, and had urged her to sign documents while she was rushing between appointments, and had no time to read them carefully. Tessa reviewed the approval records and discovered that Vivian's electronic signature had been generated at a timestamp when she was on stage, giving a keynote at an industry conference, an event with video footage that made it physically impossible for her to have completed that action herself. It was strong evidence, but not yet enough on its own to prove Blackwell had directed the scheme rather than Rowan acting alone out of some private grievance. Nolan proposed a test that carried real risk. Vivian would call Rowan and imply she was preparing to leave Chicago entirely, and if Rowan immediately relayed that information to Blackwell, they would have their confirmation of exactly where her loyalty now sat. Only minutes after that call ended, The black sport utility vehicle that had been trailing them changed position and headed directly toward the airport, arriving well before Vivian herself could have reasonably reached it. Vivian had no choice left but to accept what the evidence already told her plainly. The betrayal hurt her more deeply than losing the company itself had, because Rowan had never simply been a subordinate to her. For 8 years, she had trusted the woman like family, sharing details of her life that had nothing to do with quarterly earnings or shareholder confidence. Nolan did not offer hollow comfort, and instead told her something closer to the truth of his own history. The hardest part of what Blackwell had done to him years earlier was never the lost job or the damaged reputation, but watching former colleagues who had once promised to vouch for him go quiet the moment it became inconvenient to remember his name. Something shifted between them in that admission, and Vivian confessed, for the first time, that her practiced coldness had never been natural to her, but a shield she built early to avoid being dismissed as a fragile heir who inherited a title she had not earned. She recalled sitting in board meetings as a young executive, watching older men exchange glances whenever she spoke, and deciding early on that warmth would only give them another reason to dismiss her. It was easier, she admitted, to be respected from a distance than to be loved and doubted in equal measure. Blackwell struck back directly within the day, leaking details of Nolan's old professional misconduct allegation to several outlets, framing him as a failed auditor exploiting a disgraced executive to extort the company he no longer worked for. Nolan was suspended from his position at the tower by the end of the afternoon, his remaining access credentials cut off before he even finished reading the article himself. That evening his daughter Bryn called from her dormitory hundreds of miles away, having already seen the headlines circulating online, and asked her father plainly whether he intended to disappear from this fight the same way he disappeared from his old career. Nolan realized his daughter was not angry that he had lost his job again. She was frustrated that for years he had quietly allowed Blackwell to decide who he was allowed to become, retreating into a safe, invisible role rather than risking exposure a second time. That single phone call settled something in him more firmly than any of Blackwell's threats had managed to shake. He told Vivian afterward that from this point forward, they were no longer fighting simply to reclaim her chair at the head of the table. They were going to force Blackwell to dismantle himself in front of the very people who had once obeyed him without question. Blackwell requested a private meeting with Nolan at an exclusive club downtown, confident that a man recently stripped of his income would be easy enough to buy. Tessa warned Nolan against any unauthorized recording, explaining that anything gathered illegally could poison every piece of evidence they had collected so far. Instead, she suggested Nolan let Blackwell incriminate himself in writing, something a man of his arrogance rarely thought twice about doing when he believed he had already won. Blackwell arrived warm and disarming, admitting openly that he knew about Nolan's past and framing them both as ordinary men simply trying to protect their families from a chaotic world. He offered $2 million for Nolan's signature on a consulting agreement, one whose real terms required Nolan to delete every piece of operational data he had gathered, publicly claim Vivian had directed him to breach the company's systems, testify that she intended to crash the stock price to buy the company back cheaply, and leave Chicago entirely once the vote concluded. Nolan pretended to weigh the offer seriously and asked for the formal contract in writing before committing to anything, and Blackwell, certain of his own victory, agreed without hesitation. When the document arrived, Tessa confirmed it could support charges of witness tampering and obstruction once properly connected to the broader fraud investigation already forming around the company. Blackwell had been careful enough, however, to route the payment through an intermediary firm rather than directly through Blackwell Capital, keeping his own name a comfortable distance from the paper trail. Nolan recognized the intermediary's name from the building's own maintenance invoices, a vendor that had billed the tower millions of dollars for services nobody could actually describe when asked directly. He and Vivian traced the registered address to an empty office space listed under the name of Preston Vale's younger brother, a detail that finally connected the chief financial officer directly to the scheme rather than leaving him as a peripheral figure caught in the crossfire. Vivian wanted to release everything they had immediately, but Nolan stopped her, warning that announcing too soon would only give Blackwell time to move money, destroy records, and pin every remaining piece of blame squarely on Preston alone. What they needed was someone inside the scheme willing to confirm, on record, that Blackwell was the true final beneficiary of the stolen funds, rather than merely a distant board chairman who claimed ignorance. Nolan suggested targeting Preston's greatest fear directly, the growing certainty that Blackwell intended to sacrifice him the moment things went wrong. They sent Preston a copy of the contract meant to buy Nolan's silence, along with evidence showing Blackwell had already prepared paperwork, quietly shifting full financial liability onto the chief financial officer's shoulders alone. Preston did not respond that night, and the silence itself felt heavier than any reply could have been. Later, when Nolan returned to his apartment, he found the door unforced, but every drawer in the place opened and searched, though nothing of value appeared to be missing at all. On the kitchen table sat a single old photograph of Nolan and Bryn, placed neatly in the exact center of the room where he could not possibly miss it, a quiet message that required no violence to land its point. Nolan understood immediately that Blackwell had shifted from trying to buy him off to reminding him, without a single spoken threat, exactly who else he was capable of reaching. Nolan called Bryn that same night and asked her, gently but firmly, to stay on campus and avoid returning to Chicago until this was over, keeping the details deliberately vague so as not to frighten her more than necessary. He kept his voice steady the way he had learned 2 years earlier, back when explaining her mother's illness required a calm he did not actually feel, and Bryn seemed to sense the effort even through the distance of the call. She did not push him for the full story, only asked him to promise he would call again at the same time the next evening, a small ritual that had carried them both through harder nights than this one. Vivian felt the weight of guilt settle over her once she learned what had happened, insisting that she had pulled an innocent man's family into danger that had nothing to do with them, and urging Nolan to hand over what evidence they had to the authorities and step back entirely. Nolan refused outright, telling her plainly that Blackwell had marked him as a target a decade earlier, long before she had ever entered the picture, and that her arrival had only stopped him from running from that fight any longer. Blackwell tightened his grip further over the following days, terminating Nolan's employment formally, sending a misleading notice to his landlord suggesting he was under active criminal investigation, and feeding a tabloid story implying a secret romantic arrangement between Nolan and Vivian designed purely for financial gain. Coverage of the unfolding scandal increasingly ignored the actual evidence and instead fixated on their personal lives, exactly the distraction Blackwell needed to keep public sympathy away from either of them. Vivian wanted to hold a press conference to push back publicly, but Nolan recognized that reaction as precisely what Blackwell was hoping to provoke, since any visible anger from her would only reinforce the narrative that she had lost control entirely. Tessa filed an emergency motion asking the court to preserve company records and delay the scheduled vote, but the judge indicated he needed more direct evidence of imminent destruction of evidence before granting such a significant delay. In the middle of that standstill, Preston reached out to Nolan privately, demanding full immunity from prosecution in exchange for his testimony against Blackwell. Tessa could not legally promise anything of the kind without prosecutors involved, and Preston panicked and cut off contact almost as quickly as he had opened it. Still, the brief call left behind a distinctive background sound Nolan recognized instantly, the particular chime of an old-fashioned elevator bell used only in a handful of historic buildings left in the city. That same chime belonged to the Halston Crown, the hotel where Blackwell had scheduled the shareholder vote for the following morning, and Nolan suspected he had quietly relocated the original financial records out of the tower and into a temporary command post there ahead of the meeting. Breaking in was never an option they seriously considered, so Tessa found a lawful path instead, since Vivienne, still technically a major shareholder and disputed chief executive, retained the legal right to formally request inspection of any documents being used to justify the coming vote. Vivienne submitted that request through official channels that same afternoon, and Blackwell refused it in writing within hours, an act of open denial that itself became powerful evidence that the board was actively trying to keep shareholders from seeing information central to their own decision. Late that night, Rowan called Vivienne directly for the first time since her betrayal came to light, her voice breaking as she explained that Blackwell had just informed her she would never actually become chief executive as promised, and that he intended instead to place the full blame for the forged signatures squarely on her alone. Rowan offered to hand over everything she had, but only if Vivienne agreed to protect her from what was coming, leaving Vivienne to decide whether to rescue the very person who had helped destroy her or let Blackwell finish using Rowan as his final expendable piece. Nolan warned that Rowan's sudden change of heart could easily be a trap designed to draw them into a room where Blackwell's people were waiting, and Vivienne understood the risk clearly enough herself. Still, she refused to become the kind of leader who abandoned people the instant they stopped being useful, even someone who had wronged her as deeply as Rowan had. She agreed to meet, but only at an old church near the river, with Tessa present throughout and every document required to pass directly into legal custody rather than into anyone's private hands. Rowan confessed that Blackwell had approached her more than a year earlier, patiently cultivating every small resentment she carried, repeatedly suggesting that Vivienne would never truly see her as an equal, no matter how loyally she served. Under that pressure, she had agreed to help clone the authentication device and quietly steer Vivienne away from anyone who might have noticed the fraud sooner. Rowan admitted she had told herself, in the beginning, that she was only protecting her own future in a company that would never truly promote her past a supporting role. It was only after the forged signatures began appearing on documents she recognized that she understood how far the arrangement had already carried her past any line she once believed she would never cross. She brought with her an email chain showing Blackwell directing the cloning operation himself, a chart outlining exactly how power would be redistributed once Vivienne was removed, records revealing he intended to sell the company's key patents far below their true market value, and a memo already prepared to place full criminal responsibility on Rowan alone if the scheme ever unraveled. The one piece still missing was direct proof that Blackwell personally controlled the shell companies receiving the stolen funds, since every document so far pointed toward his influence without naming him outright as the owner. Rowan explained that Preston kept an offline storage device containing the real ledger, insurance he had built for himself, and that he had carried it with him to the hotel as leverage in case anyone tried to make him the sole target of the coming collapse. Just as Rowan finished speaking, several of Blackwell's people appeared outside the church, though no confrontation actually broke out between them. Nolan guided the group through a side exit and onto public transit, moving quickly enough to lose anyone following before they could be intercepted or questioned. Blackwell responded within hours by publicly branding Rowan a disgruntled employee secretly conspiring with Vivienne, and moved the scheduled vote 2 full hours earlier than planned, a desperate attempt to finalize everything before the courts could intervene. Nolan recognized the earlier vote for exactly what it was, a sign that Blackwell felt the walls closing in faster than he had expected. Vivian asked quietly why Nolan still believed in her after enduring so many public accusations meant to discredit them both. He told her plainly that he had never placed his trust in her title, her family name, or any carefully rehearsed statement to the press, but in the woman who could have simply disappeared once the board turned on her, and instead chose to come back and fight for the employees who still depended on her. The moment settled into a quiet stillness between them, a brief clasp of hands that said more than either of them was prepared to voice aloud, before Tessa's phone buzzed with word that a judge had agreed to hear their emergency motion at the very same hour the shareholder meeting was set to begin. They had evidence of the conspiracy now, but the one document that could tie everything directly back to Blackwell still remained locked inside Preston's storage device. Nolan built the final plan around the one trait Blackwell had never learned to control, his own certainty that he had already won. Vivian would attend the shareholder meeting the next morning, but rather than launching straight into an accusation, she would let Blackwell believe she had come simply to plead with the board for whatever remained of her family's dignity. While she played that part, Tessa prepared the emergency filing for the court. Rowan finalized a sworn statement under her attorney's supervision. Nolan reached out quietly to representatives of the larger shareholder blocks. Preston held onto the storage device until the last possible moment, and an independent auditor stood ready to verify the ledger on site the instant it became available. Blackwell instructed hotel security to bar Nolan from entering, confident a suspended employee had no legitimate reason to be present. He had not accounted for the small number of shares Nolan held through the company's standard employee bonus program, shares that under corporate bylaws entitled him to attend any shareholder meeting regardless of his current employment status. That single overlooked detail meant Blackwell could not remove him without violating the very procedures he claimed to be protecting, a mistake born entirely of his own assumption that a night supervisor could never matter enough to check. Vivian walked into the meeting room to open mockery from several board members who clearly believed she had already lost everything worth fighting for. Blackwell, convinced her spirit was finally broken, laid out his plan to sell the research division as the only responsible path left to save the company from what he called the damage she alone had caused. A handful of shareholders wavered visibly as the falling stock price weighed on every face in the room, exactly the kind of fear Blackwell had built his entire strategy around exploiting. Nolan noticed Preston glancing repeatedly toward the exit, clearly preparing to flee the building rather than hand over the ledger as promised. He crossed the room quietly and reminded Preston that Blackwell had already drafted the paperwork to make him the sole scapegoat, sliding across a copy of the very documents Rowan had provided the night before as proof. Preston understood in that moment that silence and flight led to the exact same ending, with Blackwell prepared to sacrifice him either way once the vote concluded in his favor. Just as Blackwell moved to open the formal vote, Preston rose from his seat and demanded to be heard, but Blackwell immediately dismissed him as unwell and ordered security to remove him from the room before he could finish a single sentence. Vivian finally spoke, urging every shareholder present to watch closely how quickly Blackwell silenced his own chief financial officer, pointing out that an innocent man rarely feared what his closest colleague might say aloud. The room shifted into open confusion as security moved toward Preston, and in the chaos he hurled the storage device across the floor toward Nolan just before hands closed around his arms. Nolan caught it cleanly, the device warm from being carried close against Preston's chest for hours, only to realize immediately that it was locked behind a password only Preston himself could provide, and Preston had just been dragged out of the very room where they needed him most. Tessa demanded an immediate pause to the vote so the newly surfaced evidence could be reviewed, but Blackwell refused outright and insisted every document Nolan had produced so far had been obtained through theft rather than legitimate means. Vivian did not bother arguing the point directly, and instead asked that the contract Blackwell had used to try buying Nolan's silence be displayed on the large screen at the front of the room for every shareholder present to read for themselves. Blackwell had spent decades learning to treat every room as a stage he controlled, certain that composure alone could outlast almost any accusation thrown at him, and for a moment his expression barely shifted even as the screen behind him displayed his own arrangement in plain language. He had weathered smaller scandals before by simply waiting for public attention to move elsewhere, and some small, stubborn part of him still believed this crowd would eventually do the same. Blackwell denied any connection to the intermediary firm named in that contract, his voice steady despite the murmurs spreading through the seated crowd. Rowan appeared moments later through a video call arranged with her attorney present, confirming under oath that Blackwell himself had personally ordered the cloning of the authentication device and had directed payments through that same firm to buy Preston's silence and secure other witnesses along the way. Blackwell insisted Rowan was simply lying to reduce her own exposure, though fewer people in the room seemed to believe him with each passing sentence. Nolan turned his attention back to the locked storage device, guessing the password might relate to something Preston frequently bragged about, the exact date he had been formally named Chief Financial Officer years earlier. That first attempt failed. Vivian then recalled Preston once mentioning that the most important day of his career had never actually been his official appointment, but the earlier afternoon Blackwell had privately promised to eventually make him chief executive instead. Nolan entered the date of that secret meeting between the two men, and the device unlocked at once. The independent auditor examined the ledger immediately, in full view of shareholder representatives gathered around the table, confirming that money had moved through a chain of intermediary companies before ultimately settling inside a trust controlled directly by Blackwell Capital. It was not simply embezzlement laid bare on the screen. The records also showed Blackwell had deliberately depressed the company's stock price to purchase its most valuable assets back at a fraction of their real worth once the deal closed. Tessa's phone buzzed almost immediately with word that the court had granted their emergency motion, pausing the vote entirely, ordering every financial record preserved, blocking any transfer of company patents, and mandating a fully independent investigative committee to review everything uncovered so far. Blackwell's composure finally cracked, and he turned on the board members seated nearest him, openly threatening to end the career of anyone who dared vote against him, now that the truth was surfacing in front of everyone. That threat carried clearly through his still active microphone, broadcast live to shareholders watching remotely across the country, and the room seemed to shift all at once, as though a held breath had finally been released. Board members who had stayed silent for weeks began calling for his immediate suspension. Preston agreed on the spot to cooperate fully with investigators. Rowan surrendered every device in her possession and accepted responsibility for her own part in the scheme rather than hiding behind Blackwell's collapse. Vivian did not demand immediate reinstatement as chief executive, choosing instead to ask the board to reinstate her only on an interim basis, once the independent audit confirmed her innocence beyond any doubt. That single decision, made in front of shareholders who expected her to seize power the moment it was available, earned her more genuine trust in that one meeting than years of quarterly earnings calls ever had. Security escorted Blackwell from the room in near total silence, no shouting, no violence, only the quiet weight of people who had once risen from their chairs whenever he entered, now refusing to meet his eyes as he passed. Before he reached the doors, Blackwell turned back and told Nolan he would always be nothing more than a night supervisor, no matter how this ended. Nolan answered simply that nighttime was exactly when people finally saw clearly, the ones who had assumed nobody was ever watching them at all. Vivian stood at the head of the table where Blackwell had been removed only moments earlier. And the first face she turned toward was not the board, not the cameras still recording from the back of the room, but Nolan's. 3 months passed before the independent audit fully cleared Vivian of any connection to the embezzlement scheme that had once threatened to end her career entirely. Blackwell faced formal charges related to securities fraud, witness tampering, and obstruction, and the assets tied to Blackwell Capital connected to the case were frozen while prosecutors built their case. His name was quietly removed from the boardroom where he had once dictated terms without question for nearly a decade. Preston cooperated fully with investigators, though cooperation did little to shield him from the consequences of his own choices, and Rowan issued a public apology to Vivian before stepping away from the company entirely, choosing to rebuild her career somewhere far from the tower that had once defined her. Vivian was formally reinstated as chief executive once the audit results were released, and one of her first actions was establishing an independent oversight division designed to prevent any single leader, herself included, from ever again holding unchecked control over the company's finances. She personally interviewed every candidate considered for the division's leadership, insisting the role report directly to the board rather than to her own office, a structural change several longtime employees later admitted they never expected to see from an Ashcroft. The gesture did more to rebuild trust among the staff than any public statement or press release could have managed on its own. Nolan was offered the newly created role of Director of Integrity and Internal Investigations, though he agreed to accept only after the board committed to a transparent selection process, refusing to let anyone assume he had been handed the position simply because of his relationship with the chief executive. Bryn attended the small ceremony marking his appointment, telling her father afterward that it had been a long time since she had seen him look genuinely proud of who he had become, rather than simply relieved to have survived another difficult season. That night, Nolan found Vivian standing on the very same steps where he had first found her weeks earlier, only this time she wore a proper coat of her own and no longer flinched away from the light spilling out of the tower behind her. Vivian asked whether he still thought of that first promise as an act of revenge, now that everything had finally settled. Nolan told her that revenge had only been enough to start the fight, but the truth was what had actually carried them through to the end of it. She handed back the jacket he had once wrapped around her shoulders, washed and carefully folded, and he settled it over her again without a word, the gesture carrying far more weight than either of them needed to explain aloud. The story closed on the two of them walking back into the tower together, no longer a displaced chief executive and a night supervisor nobody thought twice about, but two people who had seen each other at their most exposed and chosen, deliberately and without hesitation, to stay.